if we believe in the rule of law, a fundamental aspect of that is that there's one criminal law for everybody in the country. Now, of course, some people are more exposed to ethical dilemmas than others. And I personally have no objection whatsoever to people who are properly authorised to be part of undercover operations, which are sometimes necessary and proportionate in the fight against terrorism and serious crime. I have no problem with them being given guidance, as they currently are, as to how to operate. We would expect somebody who's trying to infiltrate a terrorist cell to commit the criminal offence of being a member of a prescribed organisation. We would expect somebody who is undercover in a drug ring to perhaps possess banned material. That's understandable. But what happens at the moment is that any prosecutor, any police officer, and then prosecutor who's looking at whether to bring charges against somebody will look not just at the evidence of what they've done, but will look at the public interest. And so guess what? There aren't loads of cases of rogue prosecutors at the Old Bailey bringing charges against undercover police officers and agents who are just doing their job in the public interest. You don't see those headlines. It doesn't happen. Now, what's happening with this legislation is that in the name of bringing this activity out of the shadows and putting it on the statute book, which some say would be a good thing, the government's going further than that. The government, for the first time, isn't just putting this activity on a statutory footing. This bill is not about putting CHIS, as they're called, intelligence sources on a statutory footing. That was done in 2000. This is just about criminal conduct, and it's about giving an immunity in advance of your activity. That's why some people call it the license to commit crime bill, even the license to kill bill, because there's no limitation on the offences that you are allowed to commit. And that is a huge step in any democracy, let alone our mature democracy that is supposed to be founded on the rule of law. And it's a big difference, you know, between, on the one hand, going into an undercover situation with certain guidance, knowing that you better behave ethically because you will be looked at after the fact. That ethical dilemma and risk is an important safeguard against abuses of power and position. That's one scenario. And the scenario that would now happen if this legislation passes is a ticket, an immunity in advance that is going to make you far bolder, it seems to me. And that brings me to my biggest concern about this bill that you touched on, Shelley, and that is that not just since the 1960s, way further back to the hunger marches, and no doubt to the Chartists, and no doubt all the way back in the history of progressive movements and protest in this country, undercover agents have sometimes acted as agents provocateurs, which means they're not just monitoring your behaviour, they're not just checking that people are behaving lawfully or gathering intelligence where they might not be, they're actually inciting crime, committing crime themselves from within otherwise peaceful protest movements in order to devalue that movement in the public eye. That has happened throughout our history, but the risk of it happening will be so much greater if this legislation passes in its current form. Just imagine this, you know, the Green movement has already been infiltrated in recent years, and terrible abuses have happened. But now, with climate catastrophe almost upon us, imagine in a few years' time, some moment when people cross a line into more militant or even violent direct action, and we will never know that perhaps the person who incited or instigated that action was actually an agent of the state. And we know, as you indicated earlier, that all sorts of progressive, let alone radical political movements that are peaceful, are causing enormous irritation to people currently in power and in government, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Stop the War, the trade union movement. A whole host of innocent, active citizens would be at risk if this legislation passes, and that means that everybody's liberties are in jeopardy if this bill is allowed to pass. So I'm so glad that you've convened this this meeting tonight, and I hope that people will go from this meeting and write to their MPs, whatever party stripe they bear, because this isn't a right wing or a left wing issue. This is basic democratic principle. This is the rule of law.
Thank you, Shami. Really useful to have your insight in terms of what the bill represents. I think a really crucial point there about the function of agents provocateurs, which I think perhaps hasn't been made enough in the context of this bill, and some practical things that people can do after tonight, you know, write to your MPs on this. I appreciate that you've got to leave us shortly, but again, thank you so much for being here. Really, really useful to have your input. Our next speaker is someone who has been personally affected by actions that this bill seeks to legalise. She's just recently been at the Royal Courts of Justice for a hearing before the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, where the police have admitted to violating a number of her human rights over a series of years during an undercover operation. I'm really glad that she's able to join us tonight and to share with us her story and to tell us more about the fight that she's waging with the campaign group Police Spies Out of Lives. A warm welcome to Kate Wilson. Kate, over to you.
Hello. Okay, hello. Well, yeah, I'm Kate Wilson, as Shelley said, and I guess I'm one of those active citizens that Shami talked about. And the reason why I'm here is because in 2003, I met a man that I knew as Mark Stone. We fell in love. We moved in together. He met my parents. He was friends with all my friends. He took part in family Christmas events, my nan's 90th birthday party. We travelled abroad together. We were life partners for almost 2 years. After we separated, we remained very close friends, right up until 2010, when I discovered that he had been an undercover police. And finding out that Mark Kennedy was who he was is another woman's story, and I'm not going to talk about that. But if you take a look at the Police Spies Out of Lives website, there's a lot of different stories there that give you an idea of the scale of this problem. So in 2010, I discovered that the man that I loved never existed, and that the relationship that we had was a lie. And I don't like talking about the personal impact of that, particularly over Zoom like this. I've never done a talk on Zoom, and it's a bit weird. But as I was introduced, yeah, I in 2011 we started fighting back. I filed a claim against the Metropolitan Police, a joint claim along with 7 other women, and my claim is still ongoing. So I've been fighting the police through the courts on this for 9 years now, and there's a lot of complicated legal arguments around that that I won't go into the detail of because it's quite boring. But we're here to talk about the Chiz Bill, and I've seen a number of letters from Labour MPs who abstained on the Chiz Bill, and the main argument for why they thought it was okay to do that seems to be because it's fronted by the Human Rights Act. So I want to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Act in the context of my case. The claim that we lodged at the end of 2011 included claims under the Human Rights Act under Article 3, which protects against torture and inhumane and degrading treatment, and under Article 8, which is the right to a private and family life. The claim started in the High Court. It's now in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in the IPT, and it was expanded in 2017 to include 5 other police officers other than Mark Kennedy, whose identities had been revealed in the intervening years. Jim Boyling, Jason Bishop, Rod Richardson, Marka Jacobs and Lynn Watson. Now, I didn't have sexual relationships with any of those officers, but I knew them all, and effectively there was an undercover officer somewhere in my life at all times between 1998 and 2010, because I was involved in political campaigning. And how this relates to the Chiz Bill is that the original police defence in my High Court claim around Mark Kennedy was that the relationship that he had to me was authorised under Section 26 of REPA as a personal and other relationship, and was therefore in accordance with the law. They've since withdrawn that defence. They have admitted that Mark Kennedy conducting a relationship with me, not only Mark Kennedy, but also his principal cover officer, violated my Article 3 rights. They violated my right to privacy. They violated my right to freedom of expression, and that the Metropolitan Police Service failed in their positive obligation to prevent those human rights violations from taking place. Reaching the point where they admitted that took around 6 years. And they maintained their defence in relation to all the other 5 officers, and also in relation to Mark Kennedy, for everything that they did outside of the sexual relationship. They said there was a REPA authorisation in place and it was therefore in accordance with the law. They've now, at the last hearing, which was on the 13th, they've admitted that all of the actions of those 5 officers and Mark Kennedy violated my right to a private and family life. All of those officers had REPA authorisations in place at the time that those violations happened. All of those officers were authorised after the Human Rights Act came into effect. And even more worryingly, there's a number of officers. Mark Kennedy is one, Jim Boyling is another. We also have Marka Jacobs, James Straven, Carlo Sirachi, Rob Harrison. All of those officers had relationships with women whilst they were undercover after the Human Rights Act came into effect and authorised under REPA. So my big concern about the Chiz Bill is that under it, if there is a REPA authorisation in place, all activity becomes lawful for all purposes, as I understand it. And it's been a long-standing criticism of ours of authorisations under REPA. A police officer in uniform would need a warrant to enter my house. They'd need a judge or possibly even the Home Secretary to authorise them tapping my phone. All that they needed to put Mark Kennedy in my bed was the signature of a senior police officer. And the evidence that we're getting through the IPT is that the authorisation process is seriously, seriously lacking. And one of the issues that is going to be heard when my claim finally comes to trial is the question of the suitability and the lawfulness of REPA to protect our rights under the Human Rights Act. So I'm very concerned about the timing of this bill. It feels like it's very clearly being rushed through to avoid scrutiny and to avoid the lessons that are going to come out of claims like mine. My claim is due to be resolved in April. The undercover policing inquiry will start hearing evidence next month. And then, of course, there's the claim against MO5 that is now going to appeal, which seems to have prompted this whole bill happening in the first place. I think it's also important to note, and this was mentioned at the beginning, the other letters that I've seen from Labour MPs also talk about national security and they talk about very serious crime. But the activities covered by the Chiz Bill are not at all limited to those things. And most of the aspects of my claim in the IPT are not being heard in secret, they're being heard in open because national security just isn't engaged. We're talking about protest groups that were being spied on that should never have been being spied on. And one of the major problems with REPA and with the authorisation process is it lumps MI5 agents infiltrating possibly terrorist organisations alongside civilian informants who are providing information on petty crime. And it puts secret political policing units like the MPOIU, which is the unit that Mark was working for, alongside tax officers and TV licensing guys. I mean, it's just mad. And our cases have shown, and it is going to come out in the undercover policing inquiry, that the authorization process was influenced by institutional sexism, it was influenced by political prejudice, and it was woefully inadequate in terms of the checks, the balances, the oversight, the intelligence case that they were working from, and that all of that led to violations of the Human Rights Act. There were, I think, 11 named targets of Mark Kennedy's operation, but he reported on over 500 people in the course of those 7 years. And I have seen some of the authorizations, and they talk about the risk of collateral intrusion and violating the privacy of people who were not targets of the operation. And the attitude of the police is basically they believe in thought crime. They say all of the individuals Mark comes into contact with are like-minded individuals, for which you can read they all believe that climate change is a thing. And that makes them legitimate targets, and there is no risk of collateral intrusion. 500 people, and the police genuinely believed that they were not violating the Human Rights Act in any way by intruding on their lives. We're only now getting answers to some of this stuff after 9 years of fighting it through the court, and because of the pressure being put on the police by independent judges. The Chiz Bill removes the right to recourse to the court effectively, because the existence of what were quite clearly useless REPA authorizations in my case would make everything that was done to me lawful, as the police originally tried to claim. So yes, I think I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to try and wrap it up there. But the Chiz Bill is basically going to make everything that we fought for pointless, because it will allow them to do the things that they did to us lawfully without anybody having the right to recourse, to even find out what was done to them. And it's happening too fast, and needs to be stopped. I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Kay. Really appreciate you speaking. I think it's really powerful for people to hear, directly from somebody who's been personally affected by this, and appreciate how personal an issue this is for you. And, being the first time that you've spoken on Zoom as well, I know this can feel like quite an impersonal environment, but I just want to extend our support. The hundreds of people that are here on this call, I can see people posting, thanking you, extending solidarity in the chat here, and as well on Facebook, I can see comments coming in there as well. And I think you make a really important point about the timing of this. It's certainly the case, isn't it, that this is being rushed through, but particularly rushed through during a pandemic. I think crucially, when it's very difficult for those of us who want to oppose this to actively mobilize against it in the ways that we might ordinarily do so. On that note, in terms of mobilization, I posted a link in the chat to a function that Unite the Union has set up, where you can very quickly email your MP. Please do make use of that. And on that note, again, our next speaker is from the trade union movement, whose rank and file have long been plagued by undercover policing, whether it be to collude in the blacklisting of construction workers fighting for safety, or the covering up of atrocities inflicted on striking miners. He is a lawyer by background and now dedicates himself to supporting the membership of Unite the Union as its Assistant General Secretary, a union which we're proud is affiliated to Stop the War Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Howard Beckett, over to you.
Thank you, Shelley, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you for all of the work that Stop the War undertakes. It's an incredible organisation, and it's a privilege to share a platform with the people who I'm sharing the platform with. It's an incredible story from Kate that is a reality of the activities of undercover policing, and to share a platform with John is a privilege. Shelley, our activity, Unite's activity in respect of this has been about trying to shine a light on the realities of undercover policing. This bill, as you correctly say, is being rushed through Parliament. Extraordinary to think that the committee stage is being dealt with in 3 hours at Parliament in respect of a piece of legislation that I think is probably the most dangerous piece of legislation that we've seen in the last 30 years. It is that serious. So Unite's responsibility and our role has been to get groups together and to try and lobby Labour in respect of the seriousness of the activities of the past and the seriousness of how this legislation prescribes the activities of the future. So we brought those organisations together. We brought Helen together, Helen Steele, who is one of the 8 women who is pursuing cases in respect of undercover police intrusions into their personal lives. Coppers who have been prescribed permission to sleep with individuals who are activists in various organisations, an unbelievable role of the state, together with victims of Shrewsbury 24, Orgreaves, blacklisting. The list goes on in respect of the activities of the undercover police, and we have brought them together and lobbied MPs and tried to show MPs that what we're dealing with is very, very real in society, and this piece of legislation doesn't just reflect the reality of what goes on in the past, but obviously permits this to go on in the future. And in respect of that, Shelley, people who are watching this Zoom will probably notice slightly differing positions. The position of Reprieve and the Pat Finucane Foundation is that, I believe it's the position of the Pat Finucane Foundation, but from their briefing, is that the legislation in respect of the activities of undercover police officers is not necessarily to be rejected. Because you can move to a situation where in countries such as Canada, you have a prescribed list in respect of crimes that cannot be committed and you have judicial oversight. The position of Shami, as she articulated it, is that the existing rule of law is the rule of law. There should be one rule of law. And the activities of undercover police officers, if they are to be permitted, have the defence of public interest and indeed the defence of duress. It was a wonderful human rights lawyer, Michael Lavery, who I was fortunate enough to work with in private practice, who took the first case for duress in respect of murder to the Supreme Court. But the reality is of the two positions is it does not matter. This piece of legislation does not look to restrict the activities of undercover police officers. It looks to legitimise the activities of undercover police officers. It is extraordinary. There is no crime that is not permissible on the face of this bill, from rape, torture, murder. There is no crime that is said to be unlawful in respect of this bill. There is a complete lack of judicial oversight. There is a subjective test at the time as to whether or not the activities can be undertaken or not. There is a disgraceful position that has been adopted as if the Human Rights Act can police this bill, when in fact the Human Rights Act might allow people to take claims for compensation, as Kate has outlined, but the Human Rights Act will not send anybody to jail whatsoever. So the reality of this bill is that the state is being authorised to undertake crimes against society, the most severe crimes against society, with subjective tests that allow them immunity in respect of prosecution. And if I can give you an example, Shelley, that perhaps will astonish people on the Zoom, the FBI in America have more legal requirements for transparency than will be required of our spy cops under this legislation. That's how serious it is. And of course, we should never see legislation in isolation, Shelley. The reality of this legislation is that it comes after we've just had legislation passed for immunity in respect of people who commit crimes abroad, 5 years of immunity for those who commit crimes of the state abroad. It comes on top of the fact that we have the Trade Union Act and all of its prescriptive legislation. Legislation now is becoming a mountain against the rights of activists and the rights of campaigners and indeed the rights of trade unionists. And it's vitally important that we get that message out. And Shelley, it would be wrong of me not to deal with the position of Labour and the position that Labour has adopted in respect of this. It is my own personal view that the Labour leadership has adopted their position because they want to present themselves as strong in respect of crime, patriotic, and indeed on the side of intelligence whenever it comes to terrorism. And that is perhaps a valid argument for them. But there is a line in the sand that they should never cross. And they have crossed the line in respect of this legislation, because this is not about presenting yourself as on the side of the intelligence or on the side of justice or against terrorism. This piece of legislation prescribes the state to commit the most serious of crimes with immunity. And I think it's wrong as well for us to ignore the fact that the Labour's Whip's office has taken a position about those MPs who vote against this, that they're not entitled to do, and they'll be reprimanded, and that reprimand will stay in the record for 12 months. Those MPs told that they are not voting in conscience, that this is not a vote of conscience. Well, I would say to the Labour Party, and I would thank Zara in respect of her vote tonight, but I would say to the Labour Party, ask Kate Wilson whether or not this is a vote of conscience. Ask those pickets on Shrewsbury who went to jail for doing nothing but exerting their trade union rights as to whether or not this is a vote of conscience. Ask those miners at Orgreaves who have criminal records and were assaulted as to whether or not this is a vote of conscience. Ask those victims of blacklisting whose lives have been absolutely destroyed because of the activity of undercover coppers as to whether or not this is a vote of conscience. And ask the family of Pat Finucane, who still do not have justice to this day from a murder in 1989, despite the fact that the Prime Minister said in 2011 that there is state collusion, as to whether or not this is a vote of conscience, because it is absolutely a vote of conscience. And the reality for all of us on this Zoom is that we know that all of the campaigns that we have called for inquiries for, from Orgreaves through to Shrewsbury to blacklisting to Stephen Lawrence, all of those, you can put a red pen through them once this legislation is on the books, because this legislation legitimizes those activities. And the idea that we will then have inquiries into those activities once this legislation is on the books is for the fairies. But I'll finish with this, Shelley, in respect of talking about a vote of conscience, to pay a tribute to a good friend of mine, Dan Carden, MP for Walton, who resigned from the front bench and made a powerful and wonderfully emotional speech in the House of Commons to say that he was voting on his conscience and he could no longer be in the front bench. And the reason why I want to reference Dan is specifically to the trade union movement. Dan knew that this bill was reference to economic well-being, was a license to run spy cops in our movement. And the reason why Daniel knows that is because his life was dictated by the reality of his father being involved in the Liverpool docks dispute in the 1990s. That was a dispute that was unofficial. It was a dispute to avoid the casualisation of work, and it was a dispute ultimately to save people's jobs. And it was the whole of the city of Liverpool who backed the dockers during that dispute, but it was unofficial. And this piece of legislation opens the door for every unofficial activity to have spy cops infiltrate them because of the reality of the phrase economic well-being on the face of the bill. So Daniel had to vote with his conscience because it was dictated to him through his entire upbringing and his entire family experience. He had to vote with his conscience and he had to vote against this bill. And I would say to everybody in this Zoom, as and when this bill goes to the Lords and as and when and if it comes back to the Commons, every Labour MP should be whipped not to vote for this bill, not to abstain on this bill, but whipped to vote against this bill and to vote with their conscience. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you so much, Howard. It's so useful to have your very detailed insight on the implications of the bill, but in particular to have you articulate how this relates to trade unionists. And it's so important to have unions like Unite, which I think has very much been leading this campaign to mobilise against the bill. And thank you as well for talking us through the politics going on in relation to the support or opposition to it. Our next speaker joins us tonight from the north of Ireland. In speaking out in relation to this bill, he's made the link to a story that many of you will be familiar with and which Howard referenced, of what happened to his late father, whose brutal murder happened in collusion with British security services. He's a representative of the people of Belfast North and as the Sinn Féin MP since December only last year. Howard already said it, but it's an honour to have you here tonight. John Finucane. John, thanks for being here. It's over to you.
Thanks very much, Shelley, and thanks to everybody who I see has linked in. I think provides some degree of confidence that there is certainly opposition to what I think everybody is united in is a very dangerous bill. I suppose naturally I will start as to where our campaign, our journey began, and that was in 1989 in February. On a Sunday evening, the 12th of February, my family, probably like many families around the world, sat down to have our Sunday dinner. And two gunmen came into the house, into the kitchen, and shot my father 14 times and my mother once. And whilst that is quite obviously a life-changing event, there were questions that we as a family naturally asked. My father was a very prominent human rights lawyer, and as a solicitor myself, I would always remind myself and others that the environment in which he practiced law in Belfast in the north of Ireland in the 1980s was a very toxic environment. It was a very different environment to the environment that lawyers are fortunate to practice in now in Belfast. And there were very few lawyers doing the type of work that he did, taking the types of challenges that perhaps we would take for granted now. Judicial review, for example, was not something that would have been utilised much, but he was young, he was successful in highlighting the state's own practices in controversial incidents, whether that was within the prisons, whether that was in controversial shoot-to-kill incidents. And prior to his death, he had received death threats relayed to him via his clients. And I think he perhaps dismissed that as an interrogation technique designed to unnerve the suspect. But that changed just a matter of weeks whenever a Conservative MP, Douglas Hogg, made a statement in the House of Commons that there were solicitors who were unduly sympathetic to the IRA. And a matter of weeks later, he was killed. So as a family, we naturally had questions to ask, and we were presented with, I suppose, the opposition that anybody who uttered the word collusion, even a family like ourselves, were nothing but Republican conspiracy theorists, that we were viewed in a certain light. That's slightly diluted to the sense that there may be a few rotten apples in what would otherwise be a very healthy and credible barrel. But over time, through the work, not just of my mother and my family, but through the work of human rights organisations, through investigative journalism, through our own fight through the courts, using our own legal challenges, we were able to, I think, show that narrative for the lie that it was. And throughout the many reviews that we've had, whether they were the reviews by John Stevens, now Lord Stevens, then the most senior officer in the United Kingdom, whether it was judge-led reviews, we have been able to show the extent of the infiltration of the gang, the group that came into our house that night and came into many other houses also. It's been described before that the system was broken, but I would take a different view. I don't think the system was broken at all. The system was working perfectly, because the amount of agents that were placed in the group that conducted the murder of my father and many others, and agents were in multiple groups in the conflict here in the north, whether it was by police, whether it was by the security services, whether it was by the MOD, and the agent in charge of the intelligence was an MOD officer who had been recruited, brought back from Germany to Belfast, specifically designed to professionalise the intelligence capabilities and the targeting capabilities of loyalism in the 1980s. He oversaw a shipment of weapons and that was able to triple the killing capacity of these groups. And Shami mentioned earlier on about agent provocateurs, and these aren't individuals who are in groups and reporting on what others are doing. These are individuals that are put into groups so that they can direct the groups, that they can professionalize and steer the targeting to those who the state wishes to take out. If your life is deemed less important than the intelligence of which the person is in that group, then it was a very simple choice. Brian Nelson, who I spoke about, was arrested and prosecuted as a result of one of the Stevens investigations. He received, not surprisingly, a very light sentence. But in the course of his trial, his commanding officer spoke about the amount of lives that he saved. And again, that was a false narrative. It was a lie that was presented to the court. And I think that whilst we continue in our campaign, and we have had success in the Supreme Court as recently as February 2019, we then had to bring the British government to court as as recently as the hearings last week, whenever they were absolutely torn to shreds in the High Court in Belfast, because the government had failed to respond to the Supreme Court. They have failed to set out how they intend to satisfy the Article 2, their human rights obligations, in having an effective investigation. And the judge, the comments of the judge last week, I think, have struck me in different ways, especially in the context of tonight's discussion, which is this bill. In the context of the delay, the judge said that this is insult on top of injury. The injury being the state carried out the murder of my father, the insult being the amount of time that it has taken, and the fact that all of the state's resources go into preventing the truth. I wonder about what would have happened had this legislation been in place in 1989. I struggle to see how we would have even started any sort of a campaign. A campaign sounds very formal. We were just a family asking questions, and questions inevitably led to more questions and more questions. And as you find with most things, the truth just bursts out, whether that's through the work of journalists or a family or through the courts. But all of those examples that I've cited, I don't understand how that would be possible under this legislation. As has been referenced, I think, by Kate, it would be more difficult, more onerous, anyway, more cumbersome to get a search warrant or tap somebody's phone than it would be to authorize somebody to commit murder. And I spoke last week on Radio 4 about the fact that effectively we are giving, the government intends to give agencies the power of self-regulation, the subjective test without any ministerial or judicial or any type of oversight. And these are agencies that have time and time again shown that they can't be trusted with that power. They not only set in place a scenario that resulted in my father's murder and many others, but they were very much part of the cover-up as well. When we met David Cameron and he apologised to us privately, and then to us and the world publicly in the House of Commons, he told us that initially he got quite frustrated, I think, at our response to what was another review of the papers. We want a credible examination of the truth so that we can be a part of that. And I think he gestured around the room in Downing Street and out towards the buildings and said, you know, there are people here that don't even want me to do this. And I think that is reflected in this piece of legislation. The 4 organisations who took the challenge about what covert agents were allowed to, what actions they were allowed to do. For the first time, I think, in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal's history, there were dissenting voices. And the government, I think, have panicked at that. They have become quite concerned. And instead of going to the way to legislate in a way that does balance human rights with protecting the rule of law, they have went so far to the right that it does authorise sexual violence, it authorises torture, kidnapping, it authorises murder. And I struggle to see what level of accountability, what level of examination, whenever there will be a Pat Finucane in the future, or women who have been treated the way Kate has so bravely and eloquently outlined tonight. I struggle to see how, as a wider society, we will know what will be going on right under our noses. And that's why I think that this bill presents such a fundamental danger to the rule of law, to democracy itself. And I welcome the fact that this meeting is taking place this evening. I welcome particularly Zara's comments in the House of Commons when she spoke so well against this. It is disappointing to see that there is a lack of a backbone, I think, from political parties who should know better. And the way that sometimes these arguments are framed, that it's either or, you're either for the rule of law or you're against, and there's no middle ground, again, is a degree of doublespeak that just simply isn't accurate. Hard has cited America and Canada as examples of countries that have legislated. It may not be perfect, and I'm certainly not singing their virtues, but they were able to legislate in a way that did prohibit certain crimes. So I think that this United Kingdom government, in line with how they deal with legacy here generally, but also with what they've authorised overseas, are continuing along that route. But as I think anybody who concerns themselves with human rights will know, it's a lifelong struggle. And I do congratulate the organisers of tonight's event, and I encourage everybody not to give up on this. So thank you very much.
Thanks to you, John. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Having yourself and Kate here in particular, and what you said about the prospect of future cases like your own being repeated is frankly terrifying, and just puts into perspective exactly what we're up against here. Again, we're all extending our solidarity for what your family's been through, and thanks for the way that you use your voice now to fight for others. I just want to remind people to keep questions coming in for John and everybody else on the panel using the Q&A function, so that I can keep track. I know we've got people watching on Facebook as well. We've got well over 300 people in total. So thanks everybody for tuning in tonight for what I think is a fantastic meeting so far, incredibly important and urgent. Our next speaker is an activist who's been involved in campaigns against austerity, racism, in solidarity with Palestine, all causes identified by those counterterrorism police as potential sites for extremists. He played a leading role in the demonstrations against Trump's visit to London in recent years, and he's a fellow national officer of the Stop the War Coalition. Shabbir Lakha. Shabbir, it's over to you.
Thanks a lot, Shelley. And thanks to everyone for joining this really important rally, and thanks to all the speakers for speaking so well. I think as the title of this rally says, this bill, the Spy Cops bill, is an attack on us all. And is perhaps unsurprising, but nonetheless shocking that the Tories would use this moment in the middle of a pandemic which they are utterly failing to get to grips with, to rush in legislation to allow state forces to commit crimes. But shocking as it is, I think it's important to recognize that is the latest in a recent trajectory of authoritarian state legislature. When Stop the War was founded in 2001, it rightly identified that an inevitable byproduct of the war on terror would be the violation of civil liberties at home. And indeed, as the wars under the Blair government began, we saw the gross violations of human rights, both in the countries that we invaded, including the mass killing of civilians and the use of torture and rendition. But we also saw the expansion of counterterrorism legislation here, which included the Prevent agenda, which gave sweeping powers to the police and border agencies, and was part of forming an overtly Islamophobic security apparatus that undermines the civil liberties of everyone. And under this Prevent agenda, we saw children as young as 3 years old being referred to the police. We saw school children with Free Palestine badges being referred to the police. We saw women who donned hijabs in their GP offices being GP surgeries being referred to the police. And I think it's important to note this, because we must understand that our foreign policy is not divorced from the domestic. And as we're now seeing, an attack on one group becomes a precursor for a wholesale assault on everyone's civil liberties. And in the last couple of years, we've seen an acceleration of this trajectory, and especially focused on campaigning trade union and socialist organizations. Last year, the government commissioned a report into left-wing extremism, which identified groups like Stop the War. As Shelley mentioned at the beginning, a police handbook listed climate campaigning organizations, anti-war and anti-austerity organizations as extremists, in the same breath as fascist groups. And last year, we also saw the police ban lawful Extinction Rebellion protests, raid their warehouses, and forcibly remove them from Trafalgar Square. And carrying on from that, this year, the police sought to do the same thing with Black Lives Matter protesters. So we can see this ongoing crackdown on civil liberties, and it's in this context we can see how dangerous this bill and the recently passed Overseas Operations Bill as well really are. And of course, as has been said, the police infiltration of political groups and trade unions has long been a feature of their activities. and the horrific abuse of power, including deceiving women into relationships, like what Kate bravely spoke about and is fighting against. We also saw a couple of years ago the revelations from the first part of the inquiry into undercover policing, which detailed the level of infiltration into peaceful groups, including the Stephen Lawrence Family Campaign for Justice. And we saw the monitoring for decades of trade union figures and MPs, including Jeremy Corbyn. So this bill allows the security services, the police officers, and various agents of the state to not only carry these things on, but to go further, as the other speakers have pointed out. And it's an absolute shame on every MP that voted for this bill and the tacit approval that the Labour leadership has given it by abstaining from it. And I want to give all credit to the MPs who broke the whip and in some cases resigned from their positions to vote against it. I think it's also important to note the timing of this bill is not only being rushed through Parliament in the middle of a pandemic, but because of the pandemic, because the government have so badly mishandled it and left so many without support and put their lives at risk. It is in this moment that trade union organizing, it has often become the last refuge of people and the only means that people can organize to defend themselves. And one of the bill stipulated areas where agents of the state can commit crimes is in the interest of the economic well-being of the UK. Well, whose economic well-being, and how will that be interpreted in relation to a trade union organization? And I think this bill also comes months after the mass mobilizations for Black Lives Matter, which specifically took a stand against racist police brutality. And it's unsurprising, I guess, that a Tory government that referred to anti-racist protesters as thugs and extremists would respond by increasing police impunity for committing crimes. Nonetheless, and I'll end on this, I think what we've seen during the last 9 months is a government in severe crisis and a government that is facing growing dissatisfaction and collective resistance, and which has been responsible for pushing them into U-turn after U-turn. So I think we shouldn't for 1 second imagine that we are powerless in this situation and that we have to accept this bill lying down and accept its ramifications. I think we have to get organized quickly and make a lot of noise. And as Howard Beckett said, the bill will be returning to the Commons, and we need to put pressure on every single MP to make sure that bill is stopped. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabbir. Really useful to have you talk about some of that more subtle policing of activism and how some of that has kind of come about as a result of the war on terror, actually, with pieces of legislation in particular, like the prevent duty. And it was actually in campaigning against that legislation and its impact on students and workers that I first got to know our next and final speaker. But before I introduce her, there's a few quick announcements I just want to make. Tonight's event has been organised by Stop the War Coalition. If you're not already signed up, please join our mailing list, and my colleague's been posting links in the chat for you. And if you're not a member of Stop the War, please consider becoming one tonight. Some upcoming events: Birmingham Stop the War meeting on US elections. Could it be Trump? Could it be Biden? What does that mean for the anti-war movement either way? On the 27th of October, with John Rees and Salma Yaqub speaking. A date for the diary: 25th of January, there'll be an International Day of Action over Yemen. So keep that in your diary if you want to get involved in that. Again, questions. If you want to get your questions in, do it now, because we're about to come to the final speaker. Use the Q&A function, and I'll try to come to as many of those at the end as I can. So our final speaker tonight is someone who it seems hard to believe has only been an MP for less than a year. She's spoken out on a number of key issues, and many of you will have likely seen the phenomenal, very moving speech she gave just weeks ago in opposition to this bill, which was received with horrendous hostility, I might add. She's one of the youngest and yet one of the wisest MPs that we have in Parliament. She's Labour's MP for Coventry South, Zara Sultana. Zara, thank you for being here tonight.
Hi everyone, thank you for that very kind introduction, Shelley. Youngest but wisest, I don't know. Echo. Okay, it's gone. It's a real pleasure to be speaking tonight alongside some excellent comrades. To Kate and John, it's an absolute honour to be on the same platform with you both. So thank you to Stop the War for inviting me. Like Shelley said, my name is Zara Sultana. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Coventry South, and I was one of the 21 MPs, 18 who were Labour, who voted against the I keep saying Spy Cops, it's really hard. Spy Cops bill at its second reading. And then I was one of the 98 MPs who voted against the bill at its third reading, by which time we had 34 of my Labour colleagues joining us within the 98 overall. And I don't break the whip lightly, no one does. But when I read up on the bill and what I understood in terms of what it meant for human rights, the extension of state power, well, I couldn't abstain, I couldn't sit by and let that happen. And like other panelists have talked about, we know that state agencies and state agents aren't always benign. They don't always act in the interests of the public. John and Kate know that better than anyone else, and I just want to pay tribute to them for their campaigning on these issues and fighting back against the injustices that they have experienced so that no one has to go through that again. And that's why in my speech in Parliament, I thought it was really important to raise what has happened to people like them, to remind people in the benches opposite, but also in the benches that I was also in, that state agents have truly done horrendous things in our name. And personally, growing up, it was clear to me that the state wasn't always friendly or innocent. In schools and at university, I remember the watching eye of Prevent, how it targeted Muslims, disproportionately policing my community, and how it was used to silence political campaigns I was involved with, like the struggle for Palestinian rights. So it's from experiences like that that have shaped me, that mean that I'm not naive enough to think that the state is always acting rightly, or that in the past it used to get things wrong and is now suddenly benign. So when I looked at the bill and when I read its provisions, I was horrified. Like other panelists have said, it gives a license to criminality to a dizzying array of bodies. By this bill, murder can be licensed, torture can be licensed, even sexual assault can be licensed. And this can be granted to everyone from the Environment Agency to the Food Standards Authority. And I'm still a bit confused why the Gambling Commission might need to torture someone. That's still beyond me. And the bill gives these powers not just to protect national security, and even that phrase itself, there's a slippery slope, but also to promote the economic well-being of the nation and to prevent disorder. All of this with minimal oversight, with authorization granted internally within organizations, meaning no warrants or independent judicial review. And like others have mentioned, that's less oversight than what is needed for phone tapping or even police searches. And one of the really frustrating things about being in Parliament is that you'll get Conservative MPs, and John isn't having to deal with this, who think of themselves as the champions of civil liberties. They'll go up in the chamber, they will half-heartedly raise some point, and then the minister will give some nonsense, answer, and then the MP will sit down thinking, job done, let me just pat myself on the back as I've now spoken up for human rights, as if it's easy to do that and then walk in the eye lobby with the rest of their colleagues. And what made it really difficult and frustrating was how embarrassingly weak their arguments were. And still now, I can't make sense of them. For example, the government said that the bill couldn't specifically outlaw torture, because if it did, then criminal organizations who use that, criminal organizations will use that to test whether or not someone is an undercover agent. But in the next breath, the government minister will say that the undercover agents would be debarred from committing that torture because they're covered by the Human Rights Act. And it's one or the other, it really can't be both. Either undercover agents need to be able to commit torture to pass some imaginary test that criminal organizations might set them, or human rights are too important for that to be allowed. And when there's such obvious nonsense where in one breath you're saying one thing and in another breath you're contradicting that, then there's always going to be some cause for alarm. And finally, and I'll finish on this to allow some Q&A, one of the things that really troubles me about this bill, and others have spoken about it too, is that you can't see it in a vacuum. It's not alone. In the space of simply a few weeks, the government has put forward the Overseas Operations Bill, which is coming back into Parliament in 2 weeks' time after recess. And this decriminalises torture for British soldiers overseas. It has also drawn up proposals to ship asylum seekers more than 4,000 miles away to Ascension Island. It has proposed banning anti-capitalist teacher materials in schools, and now it has put forward the Spy Cops Bill. And like I said in Parliament, I believe that we have to take this descent into authoritarianism seriously. It's not just a soundbite. It's not just a distraction tactic. These are a series of measures that concretely enhance the powers of the state and undermine our civil liberties, and they are being rushed through during a global pandemic. So meetings like this are crucially important. We need to keep, amplifying our concerns and raising this up the agenda and making sure that people know what this Conservative government is up to, so that we can build the strongest, biggest opposition to fight back and defend our rights. That's what I will continue to do in Parliament, and I look forward to doing that together with everyone on this call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara, and thanks for your fierce opposition. It's really great to have you here tonight, and it's really great to have you fighting on behalf of us all in Parliament. I'm going to go straight into questions now because we've got quite a few. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to take a few questions at a time and then come to panelists individually to answer one or all or a few as they wish to do so. The first one I'm going to read out comes in from somebody anonymously. It says, what's the best course of action to take to stop this? So what can we as activists practically do? Is there a simple infographic we can share to get people to rally against this? Next one is from Kasaba. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, who's writing in from Hungary. So it's great to have some international attendance. This bill flies in the face of most human rights regulations, both international and European. If it is indeed enacted, is there a chance to turn to the European Court of Human Rights? John says that one reason stated for not opposing the bill is that the Human Rights Act prevents state abuse. How likely is that really the case? And final question I'll come to is from Wendy. Do panelists think the Spy Cops Bill and Overseas Operations Bill, which Zara just mentioned, are being rushed through in advance of the likelihood of civil unrest in 2021 on Black Lives Matter, climate crisis, and so on? So quite a few questions there from a few people ranging from legalistic to activist-based activities, and what can we do practically? Howard, if you don't mind, I'm going to come to you first to answer any one or all of those questions.
Thanks, Shelley. I'll try and rush through all of them. What to do? Well, obviously, the key in respect of this is the position of the Labour Party. We need the Labour Party to back amendments in the House of Lords and make sure that this bill goes back to the Commons. And at that stage, we need the Labour Party to actively oppose it. And so I would say to everybody who is in the Labour Party and who has an influence in their CLPs to carry that influence. There's a number who have already passed motions against this bill, and it's that type of pressure that needs to be brought to bear, as well as meetings such as this. And really, it is to out the lie, and it is a lie, that the Human Rights Act in some way polices this legislation. It does not. The Human Rights Act is on the face of the bill, but the government has already said that they do not accept that the Human Rights Act polices this. But even if it did police this, it only polices it insofar as giving people the potential entitlement to sue the state for compensation. It is not a replacement for any criminal judiciary overseeing the actions of police. So one of the questions, Shelley, was about the Human Rights Act. That is an outright lie. The Labour Party front bench need to be honest about this, that the Human Rights Act is no judicial cover for criminal acts. It is only in reference to the potential for civil compensation. The European Court of Human Rights questioning this bill, no, unfortunately, will be out of the European Court of Human Rights in a short period of time, I'm afraid, and its coverage in respect of this bill will be impacted by Brexit, and it wouldn't cover it in any event. Spy cops and overseas operations and civil unrest, well, maybe they are looking at the potential of civil unrest in the not too distant future. Certainly in respect of the Black Lives Matters protest, the reaction of the government has been very scary indeed. But I think really, if we're being truthful, this is an extraordinary right-wing government that sees the opportunity of a COVID crisis to force through legislation that they know at some stage in the future will be useful for them whenever it comes to dealing with campaigners. And it is that reality of them taking advantage of COVID that is clear to me. Shelley, I'll just say one thing in respect of that in case people in the Zoom do not know it, but the Department of Education recently released around a list of people who should be allowed or disqualified rather from going into schools to talk to children. And on that list was those who are proponents of the end of the capitalist system. So you can see where all of the departments of government are heading to.
Thank you, Hal. A very thorough response. Really appreciate that. Shabbir, I'm going to come to you next, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll just try and take a couple of those on. I think the last question on the government trying to rush this through because of civil unrest, I'm sure that's part of the calculations. I think Black Lives Matter, and as I said, the growing kind of resistance in workplaces and trade unions has probably scared the Tories. I also think, as Howard mentioned, that they're using COVID as a premise to rush this. But I think, as Zara mentioned as well, we have to look at this as part of a longer term trajectory, and it's something that the state has been pursuing kind of incrementally over time, and therefore I think we need to deal with it as such, and that is to kind of amplify the resistance against it. And so on that note, on the best course of action, I think obviously at the moment it's a bit difficult to mobilize on the streets, but I think we can, sign petitions and lobby the MPs. Howard mentioned the importance of getting the MPs on side at this stage. And I think we need to build our infrastructure as a movement. We need to have meetings like this and get to grips with the arguments like this, and make sure that in all our localities people are understanding the issue and getting organized, and if and when the moment comes we can be on the streets and make our voices heard. So yeah.
Thank you, Shabbir. Kate, if I could come to you next on any of those questions.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to the one about the Human Rights Act. I mean, I already addressed this, but I think it's really important to remember that the Human Rights Act and the REPA authorization process have been in place for the last 20 years, and they didn't prevent this stuff happening. And there needs to be a specific prohibition on rape. There needs to be a specific prohibition on torture. And there obviously needs to be a specific prohibition on murder in this bill. It's inconceivable that they wouldn't have that. I'd also very briefly like to address the question about coming unrest in 2021, just because one of the worries I always have about speaking publicly about these things is that the awfulness of our experiences are going to stop people, they're going to scare people, and I'm sure that that's one of the reasons that the police and the state do this sort of thing. And I always think it's really important to say that what happened to us happened because we were doing something right. And in the information that I've seen and in the documents that I've had disclosed, the mission creep within the police service and the bubble that they were living in and the way that they authorized these operations, and the fact that they were basically approaching political dissent and political action like as a form of thought crime. The state needs to take a really good look at that, because they talk a lot about the bad guys, and the bad guys weren't us. It's really clear when you look at the story, the bad guys weren't us. So I really hope that people won't be put off by this stuff, and people will carry on fighting for these issues, because we really need that. And I think it's always important to say that when we address these topics, because they are scary, but we need to carry on.
Thanks, Kate. John had to drop off the call but is now back, but I don't think he heard me read out the question, so we'll come to you in the next round if that's okay, John. Zara, if I could come to you though.
Yes, best course of action, send your MP emails, request meetings with your MPs, talk to them about your concerns, especially if they have abstained. And yeah, like, you know, petitions and all of those things are really important. The more emails an MP gets about something, you know, they have to respond. I have to respond to emails that are being sent from my constituents. So please do that, especially with the bill returning at some point in the near future, and showing that there is growing mobilization around this. On the question of the Human Rights Act, others have covered it. One of the things that I also said in my speech was that the government themselves said in November 2019 that in tasking CHIS agents that the state is not the instigator of that activity and cannot be treated as somehow responsible for it. So that through the government's own words, they are not responsible, and the bill would place no limits on the crimes agents could be authorized to commit. So that's taken them from with their own words. And then on the point of civil unrest, well, I think one, we have seen, you know, a growing climate movement, especially with Extinction Rebellion, with Fridays for Future, and that is only going to grow further, you know, as we're seeing more and more impacts of climate change in our communities and across the world. We've seen amazingly large Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and even, you know, the students who were demonstrating against the GCSE results, some of these U-turns and that the government has, you know, done, I think have been to stop more and more people coming to the streets, right? Because then all of these campaigns come together with the evictions ban. There are all of these crises that are happening in our society. And, you know, this is the state extending its powers under the guise of a pandemic. So, you know, people are focusing on whether they've got a roof over their heads, whether they're going to be able to pay their bills at the end of the month, and they can creep this sort of legislation through. So we have to be really mindful. We can look at what's happening across the world with Trump, Bolsonaro. You know, this is the same, you know, blueprint that this government is also following as it, you know, moves into a more authoritarian state. So we just have to fight back. We have no choice. We have to keep mobilizing and, yeah, educating and agitating.
And organising. Thanks, Zara. That's a really good point, actually, that you pointed out, that there has been U-turns in recent months on issues following, you know, huge opposition. And if we were in different times, we would obviously be taken to the streets, but there are other ways that we can, of course, show our opposition to this. On that note, Terry has asked, would there be a model motion available for CLPs? I know there are some knocking around because my own CLP passed one. Perhaps if there's anybody in the chat who has got access to one, could post a link, or if not, we could look into Stop the War, putting one online so that people can get access to that. Which reminds me, if you're not signed up to my mailing list yet, sign up so you can get emailed about things like that. There's a question here, it's quite long, but I want to read it word for word. It's from Richard. He says, a natural comparison is the anti-union legislation passed before the miners' strike. In their biographies, those high up in the Conservative Party were clear that they passed this legislation to crush the miners. I'm not sure who he's referring to here specifically. Who in the modern Conservative Party is driving these changes, and what is the equivalent conflict they will use these powers in? Also, why do you think this legislation is being passed at this moment after the threat to the establishment power in the form of the Corbyn movement has already subsided? I'm going to be looking to Howard in particular on that question. Hesina asks, why would the Food Standards Agency need to use this bill? I mentioned at the beginning that this bill doesn't just apply to the police and the army, but it also includes the Gambling Commission, the Consumer Markets Authority. Very peculiar arms of the state will be given the ability to commit crimes with impunity. Final question that I'll come to is anonymous again. Could this legislation protect the state from families seeking High Court legal redress for the way the state has failed to protect and shield their relatives in care homes? I assume that they're referring to state negligence of people dying from COVID-19 in recent months. So if I could go in the order that I came to you before, that's starting with Howard again, please.
Thanks, Shelley. I'll deal with two of them. The last question, no, this legislation isn't intended to cross into issues in regard to civil responsibilities for those who have passed away or been injured as a result of negligence of government or employers through exposure to COVID. Indeed, we're running quite a few cases in respect of employers who have negligently expose people to the risk of COVID, and we'll have to wait to see where that legislation goes. The question in respect of, the miners' strike and the trade union legislation and such like, I think this is a catch-all piece of legislation. It's intended to catch all activism. It's intended for the government to have a clear ability to infiltrate any activist organisation. It's intended to have the ability to authorise people to carry out crimes. It's obviously the narrative is around fighting terrorism and fighting organised crime, and there will be undercover operations today where police officers are selling drugs because they're part of a drug organisation. But those police officers have an existing protection from prosecution, and that's called public interest, and that's the point that Shami is making. If you're going to introduce legislation like this, it has to be legislation that is intended to limit the actions of undercover agents, not to facilitate the various actions of undercover agents. Obviously, Shelley, it goes without saying that this government is no friend of the trade union movement, despite what Rishi Sunak might try to purport whenever he puts out offers to people in respect of job support schemes and claim that he has the support of the trade union movement. They are no friends of the trade union movement. If they could do away with the organising of labour and the organising of a collective, they would do so. Undoubtedly, they would. I've got no doubt that it is part of their whole agenda to get rid of the responsibility of trade unions. The funding of the Labour Party goes with it, obviously. The person who I would put as being responsible for all of these things is probably Dominic Cummings. Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. I've just seen a message here from Stop the War saying that a model motion will be up probably in our newsletter tomorrow. So if you sign up, that can be circulated for you to put to your local Labour parties, trade union branches, or whatever else it may be. So thank you for that. Shabbir, can I come to you on any or all of those questions, or as we're getting to the end of the meeting, any final closing remarks as well?
Sure. I mean, just to add to Howard mentioning Dominic Cummings, I would say Priti Patel is probably one of the most vociferous proponents of some of these things, but I don't think it is down to one individual. I think it is kind of a kind of wholesale strategy. Just to address the question on the kind of the threat to the establishment has subsided, I think that's not true at all. I mean, I think that in the last year, what we've seen is, continuing polarization in society and growing dissatisfaction with the Tories. This is a government facing multiple crises, not just in terms of the health crisis and the economic crisis, which is failing to deal with, but in terms of the political crisis and the fact that people are probably at their lowest rates of trust in the government and are organizing in communities and workplaces and campaigns across the board. And like Zara mentioned as well, they've been forced into U-turn after U-turn, completely by public pressure and by groups of people. So I don't think the threat to the establishment is gone. I think probably the experience of Corbyn would make them want to maybe push the stopping the teaching of anti-capitalist materials in schools or whatever to try and preempt stopping that happening again. But I think more than that, they are scared of campaigning organizations and the role of the movement in being able to impact the situation and affect change, and that's what they want to stop. And so I think as a kind of closing remark, that's exactly what we have to do even more, and the more organized we get and the more we build, the better position we'll be in to resist the likes of this bill and every other assault that the Tories put forward against us.
Thanks, Shabbir. Kate, if I can come back to you again on any of the questions or any closing remarks that you might want to make.
Well, I wanted to respond briefly to the question that raised the matter of the miners' strike and who's driving what's going on now. Slightly anecdotal, but I think it's going to be very interesting watching the undercover policing inquiry, because the NUM were made core participants in that inquiry as an organisation, and there's still no information come out about why, and I think there's going to be a lot to come out about that story, and that the history of the miners' strike and police spying. There's a lot of information still to come. When our story first hit the papers, the Minister for Policing, Nick Herbert, was in the Commons, and he was making a speech about how officers would never be authorised to have sexual relationships. And in the middle of that speech, somebody came in and handed him a note, and he did a U-turn on the spot. And he said, but of course we couldn't ban officers from having sexual relations undercover, because that would make a ready-made test for undercover officers, which is basically the argument that they're using now. And I was watching that live, and I remember thinking, this is MI, that, you know, the Secret Service, they're there, politicians come and go every 4 years, we have elections, they change, but the civil servants, and particularly the Secret Service, they're there, and I think that's who is driving this. And I think that, like I said before, I think that they are pushing it through because nobody's noticed this stuff. The reason why you need a very stringent authorization to tap a phone, but not to authorize an undercover officer, is because they got caught out with the phone tapping scandal and the law was changed. And I think what we need to be doing is pushing. They've been caught out now. And because REPA covers everything from the tax office right through to military intelligence, they've been caught out, and I think the law is going to have to change. And I think that there are people who've had a lot of freedom for a long time to do whatever they wanted to do. And they are the ones driving this because they don't want to lose that freedom. And I think that's where we need to be pushing, is to get REPA and the underlying laws around authorization changed.
Thanks, Kate. That's a really interesting comparison with phone tapping. That's a very good point. If I could come back to John again now. John, if you're able to respond to Elia's question again, if there's anything you want to say, any calls to action as we near the end.
Yeah, thanks, and apologies that I had to leave. There was just another meeting that I had to briefly go into, but I think one of the worrying things is that when groups such as, even groups as bizarre as the Gambling Commission or the Food Standards Agency, when organisations, any organisation, or even security services or police have these powers subject to correction, I've never been aware of any of those type of groups coming back saying we actually don't need these. They go too far, we don't use them. Thanks very much for that. And I know I'm, perhaps being a wee bit trivial with that, but the danger is that once you give people the power to carry out certain acts, they need to justify having that power. They need to justify the resources that have been put in place to make sure that they are equipped to use that power, and it almost becomes self-perpetuating. And we've seen that in the context of the conflict here. We have seen that, I think, with the examples in England, and I think that we will see that going into the future. Now, what I think the benefit of meetings like tonight is, and the good thing is that I think, Shelley, you'd referenced that there was over 300 people. 300 people are going to go on to hopefully talk, to all of their friends, their family, their work colleagues. They're going to lobby, whether it's their councillors, their MPs, write letters, be active. And I think the good thing that I've really appreciated tonight is that we've talked about the arguments that have been put up. We've answered that question about, well, what about the Human Rights Act? We've answered the question about, well, you have to authorise everything, because otherwise there would just be a simple test that gangs would use to find the informer, which is bogus. It's completely bogus, and it's been shown as such by other agencies around the world. So I think that, the fact that there's been such an interest in this meeting tonight, that there is still such an interest in this debate, I think is encouraging. We must be positive as we move forward, and it's about using the information, and hopefully everybody who's been in the meeting tonight has that confidence to go forward and really challenge their MPs, challenge their legislators, challenge the media as well at any opportunity they can, because there is a bogus argument, as I referenced earlier, that it's either law and order or anarchy, and only this particular piece of legislation. And over the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there has always been the piece of legislation of that particular day, which erodes fundamental rights that citizens would have. And it's always the case of, well, we are the party of law and order, that's why we must do this. So again, I just want to thank the organisers of tonight's discussion. And I think the contributions have been excellent. And hopefully those who have listened in certainly feel a little bit emboldened that they can go forward and, you know, not accept defeat on this.
Thanks, John, and thanks to you for being here tonight. I think you made a good point about if everybody, you know, hundreds of people that are here tonight go away, talk to their friends, talk to their family, talk to their colleagues about this issue. And this meeting will be going up on Stop the War's YouTube page. So even share this meeting so that more people can access it later. I know there's been more people on Facebook as well, and it's recorded and saved on there again. So just get sharing, get spreading the word, and get lobbying, as others have said. I'm going to now come to our final speaker to respond to any of those questions, and again give us a little bit of a take-home message. So it's over to Zara Sultana.
Thanks, Shelley. I'll be quite quick. So where is this coming from? This is not an accident, like we're saying. This is deeply ideological. Why would a party who has a choice make a decision to essentially starve working class kids from having free school meals during the holidays, right? Like when there is not a shortage of money, when they can give hundreds of millions to their friends at Serco and various other profit-making companies. This is a party that is deeply ideological. We've seen Boris Johnson previously purge MPs who opposed of his thinking before the Brexit, before we had the general election, and all to do with Brexit. And now we're seeing conversations around colonialism. Kemi Badenoch the other day was just talking about how we shouldn't be talking about white privilege, and all of these things are coming from a party that is deeply ideologically right-wing and has been heavily influenced by right-wing think tanks. And there is, of course, this international collaboration that is happening, across Europe, across the US, and including our own government with these networks of right-wing extremist thought. So I think it's something to be aware of, and also just be organizing against, and not thinking that, these are a few bits of legislation. It's the common theme. It's a thread throughout everything that they have brought forward. Has the threat to the establishment subsided? I don't think that they've packed their bags and given up and thought, there are no more threats coming. We've seen trade union membership over the pandemic increase massively as people have seen the work that trade unions are doing, making sure that, workplaces are COVID secure, but also the right to work from home, and also challenging bosses who are not taking health and safety seriously of their employees. And then there's people like Marcus Rashford, a Manchester United striker, who seems to have put real fear in the Tories, this one, young lad from Manchester. And that's because the politics that we are talking about and the issues that we are talking about, most people would understand and oppose. And, that's how movements build, and that's how public consciousness increases. And they will always try to, character assassinate or infiltrate and all of these other mechanisms. So when I think of people like Marcus Rashford, now, there will be campaigns to, make him less credible. And he already is talking about, I don't have the language of politicians, as though you need to have a certain vernacular to be able to talk about poverty. You just need to have the real lived experience and good politics. That's all you need, and the desire to make structural change. So the threat essentially to the establishment has not subsided. All the crises that people were putting plasters over are fully exposed through this pandemic. And what that means is we have a lot of organizing to do, and a lot of coalitions to build, and a lot of awareness to raise. And this is one of the things that we can all do. On the left, we have to have hope. We have to believe that things can change. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't bother doing anything, and we wouldn't have won the things that we have won, because the ruling elite will always tell us that it's impossible until it's done. So that's what I would say. Thank you for joining us tonight, and make sure that you contact your MP and you send them lots of emails and request lots of meetings until they listen to you.
Thank you, Zara. If only they were all like you and all listened like you do. Thanks to you, thanks to everybody, all our speakers tonight, and thanks to everybody who's joined the meeting, because that's what makes these things possible. That's how we continue to grow our movements and build these coalitions. I'll just end by finally saying again, if you haven't joined Stop the War's mailing list, sign up so you can hear about meetings just like this in future. Become a member if you haven't already. Thanks again to everybody. Don't forget to share it once it's up online. Look after yourselves, your friends and your families. Stay safe, comrades. Solidarity.